Welcome to You Don't Have to Yell, the podcast and webcast focused on electoral reform as a way to denudify the US political process. Yes, I just invented that word. With me today is Professor Ray LaRaja, Professor of Political Science at UMass Amherst and Director of the UMass Poll as well. Did I get that right, Ray, or no?
I'm second in command there, associate.
Okay, well, I just promoted you, but that doesn't count for a lot. So thank you for joining me, Ray. Um, Today, the reason I invited you here is I read some of your work on campaign finance, and you have a very I wouldn't necessarily call it counterintuitive, but certainly a less than intuitive approach to reforming it that I really want everybody to understand and dig into. But before we get into that, I think it makes sense to give a quick history of modern campaign finance law in America. And Ray, I'm going to spout it off really quick, and you tell me at the end whether I've passed or failed Professor LaRaja's class. But if you look at the state of affairs, again, for those of you listening, really there wasn't any effort to restrict campaign finance from private sources in elections until about 1904 with the Tillman Act. And even that was relatively loosely enforced. Watergate is when things really got serious. At that point, voters were very concerned about campaign finance. The Federal Elections Campaign Act was established that placed caps on spending and contributions. Provisions of that were struck down in the Supreme Court not too long after that, giving parties unlimited ability to raise and spend money, which then turned into soft money. McCain-Feingold was passed in 2002 to restrict the soft money, which was then struck down in court in Citizens United and a couple of other smaller rulings. And now we have the Wild West we have today, where parties have their caps in terms of contributions, and it is just a total free-for-all. It's a total free-for-all for single issue groups or for the ultra wealthy to fund their own PACs. How'd I do, Ray?
I think you got it.
All right, there. I was trying to figure.
There has been efforts a long time to. Going back to the Civil War, people talked about it.
Yeah.
But the big thing was 1974 when they really tried to tighten things up and provide an enforcement mechanism, because, as you said, there wasn't any enforcement mechanism. But as far back as the Civil War, they were trying to prevent people from giving money to the parties.
Yeah.
So, with not much effectiveness, I'd say.
Yeah, and it's funny too, because it seems like the first law that really had teeth was FECA, was the Federal Elections Campaign Act in 74. And since then, it's been a constant tug of war between the desire to put some cap or some restrictions on who can contribute and how much, and on freedom of speech, which is kind of where these issues always ended up getting gutted in the courts. Now, from your work, and you can state it better than I can, but it seems to me like what you've seen is that our current campaign finance system, where parties are handicapped in terms of fundraising, has created this power vacuum, I should say, that's been filled by the ultra wealthy and by ideological groups. Am I right there?
Yeah, that's you've got it right. The effort to restrict money has had this unintended effect of hurting what I consider to be a very important institution in our politics.
Mm.
So that's exactly right.
Yeah, and so what's been the result of, again, these private organizations and the ultra wealthy having that outsized influence on finance in campaigns?
Yeah. Well, as the saying goes, wealthy people are not like you and me, and they have different set of agendas and policies and many interest groups that represent them. And so they've become in many ways like what parties used to be. They are now the gatekeepers of politics. When I say that, I mean they decide who's likely to run for office because they encourage people to run. They can fund them. They set the political agenda. And research shows, including my own, that donors tend to be much more extreme than the average American. And they have a different set of agenda items that they care about than the average American. And so I'm concerned that the system has become extremely unrepresentative, not just in the sense of, corrupt influence that is focused on in politics, but just the sense of who's deciding who runs for office and wins.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So that's been a big concern.
Yeah. And so in your research, do you have any examples you can cite or any data that the folks listening and the folks watching can get their head around or use to get their head around the impact?
Yeah, well, so sometimes it works. Well, one example is most recently this member of Congress, youngest member of Congress, Cothern Madison, I think his name is.
Mm-hmm.
And he was running in a primary in North Carolina, has no experience. No one knows much about him, but he was bankrolled by a group called the Club for Growth. Many multi-millionaires fund that organization. And they look for what they would think of as libertarian economic candidates who just want to no restrictions on government, getting rid of government regulations.
Mm-hmm.
And he beat someone who was more of an establishment figure that people in the party tended to prefer.
Yeah.
And the result is we have someone in Congress who has no experience, and he's got a background that he's been accused of sexual harassment, and he's not really the type of congressman the founders envisioned.
Yeah.
I'll put it that way.
Yeah. Yeah. And, one of the things that I picked up from reading your stuff is it seems like the parties on the whole provide a filter that keeps people like that out and tend to really nominate candidates that have a wider appeal than, let's say, those single issue groups might. Am I correct there?
Yeah, that's exactly right. So there's been a lot of recent research about this, not just in the United States, but elsewhere, that parties, again, I'm gonna use the word gatekeeper, and it's essential for democracy to have some filter to prevent inexperienced people and demagogues from running for office. And so parties, in some sense, are the vital cog that makes democracy work and continue to function. And we've had a weakening of that around the world in advanced democracies, including in our own country, I would argue. Mm-hmm. And it's not all because of the money, but a big part of it is about the money. Who gets to run for office? And so the parties have been pulled away from that role by many sets of reforms, both campaign finance and other reforms, such as I would argue party primaries weaken them because now anybody can run for the nomination. So that's weakened their role. And campaign finance has made it such that they can get support directly from these other groups that have different sets of agendas or make emotional appeals to a subset of Americans who are very active. And that's what's going on right now. And it's very worrisome that we don't have a situation like we can vet these people in a better way.
Yeah. And so maybe to dive or to double click on that one there, like, what are some of the ways that parties, I guess, used to filter candidates versus the way it all happens now?
So, well, if you go back, when parties were thriving in the 19th century, a lot of it was about, they didn't pick people based on their knowledge of policy. They picked people who were loyal to the party, who were going to go out there, run a good campaign, be party loyalists, and then serve in Congress. Or sometimes they would say, it's your turn to run in the state legislature. Party bosses had a lot of say in where these people ran. And so they felt obligated to kind of listen. And, people didn't like that, but I could point out some good reasons for that was good. And then as society became more educated, you didn't need the parties as much because you can appeal and technology, you could appeal directly to voters through radio, through television. So money became more important than having party workers knock on doors. Now we're seeing more of the going back to the old grassroots stuff, but money became really important, and the technology enables candidates to appeal directly on their own using these mass marketing techniques. And so that loosened up the party role, and they've never fully recovered from that, except for raising a lot of money. But even there, they're behind other groups.
Yeah, I've never heard it framed that way. And the thing I was thinking as you were talking is it seems like the party's number one value is the ability to deliver word of mouth in a world where mass communication was was less sophisticated. And one of the things I've seen in some of the past episodes I've done too is once you get radio, and definitely once you get television, all of a sudden the costs of campaigning go up dramatically, because what used to be what used to be needed to run a campaign was, to rent out an event hall or maybe decorate it or something like that, and now it's gotten far more expensive. um, I'm going to throw kind of a curveball at you, or not a curveball, but something that I didn't think of originally when we were planning this out, which is, there's a chart I love to cite, and I'll share it in the show notes online for this episode, that shows the level of overlap in Congress. So people who voted, who are like Republicans who crossed the aisle to vote for a Democratic policy or a liberal policy, and vice versa. And overlap's pretty high up until like around 1980, and then it just falls off a cliff, which also happens to be right around the time, campaign finance or that the era of campaign finance, modern campaign finance, first started. And I guess my question to you, it's kind of a chicken and egg question, but do you think it's the funding that caused the hyperpartisanship, or I should say the use of mass media that caused the hyperpartisanship, the funding that was needed to campaign on mass media, or the regulations that hobbled the party? Do you get what I'm saying there, or no?
That's a huge question, and it's a puzzle that political scientists are still trying to untangle.
Yeah.
I think you hit on many of the key themes. I mean, one thing we start with is there's been a level of sorting in the electorate itself. People going to, but there's many of us think it's also elite driven. The people who come into politics have a different set of incentives, a different desire to do things. As I said in the past, being a loyal party member, you work your way, you're an apprentice, you work your way up the ladder, and you don't stray too far from party principles. And most importantly, you are dedicated to your local constituency, not national constituencies that have an issue-based focus. So you're more concerned about bringing money to fix that senior citizens hall than you are about issues involving abortion or guns or something like that.
Yeah.
So that's changed quite a bit right there.
Yeah. Well, my favorite example I love to cite is campaigns in Maine, or, politicians in Maine campaigning about security at the border with Mexico. It's like you couldn't possibly be further from there, but, sure, it must be a priority to the folks in Maine. So specifically then on the issue of campaign finance, like what are some reforms you'd recommend to counter this effect?
Well, as you know, I'd like political parties to control more money. And, a couple of reasons for that is they do tend to look for candidates who fit their constituencies better. It raises the odds of winning. So they're not going to be, interest groups, they throw a lot of chits in there. Let's say we might not win this race, but if we do, gosh, we get a person who's totally loyal to us. Whereas parties, let's play the probabilities. We don't care what they stand for. Let's get them elected. Now, some people don't like that, but it ups the odds of getting more moderate candidates. The other thing is parties are more transparent and accountable. We know what they stand for. Some of these groups, Club for Growth, who are they? Americans don't know who they know who the Republican Party is, and they can punish them. So there's accountability and transparency there. So those are two very basic factors for why I would like to see more money go to the parties who are the coalition builders rather than the fragmenters.
Yeah. Yeah. And so would you say then maybe remove the caps, for example, on contributions, or remove some of the restrictions around spending? Is that what you think would work, or is there other stuff that's maybe a little more targeted?
I think those would be main things I would recommend. Let people give higher contribution limits to parties. I'd even consider taking them off. Some countries don't even have contribution limits to parties, like Sweden. I would consider that. Although one thing it does, it protects the donors from shaking down. I mean, it protects, donors from being shaken down by parties to give unlimited amounts. At least you could say, I could only give this amount.
Yeah.
But I would make those very high. Every civic organization, and parties are civic organizations, needs patrons. They can't just rely on small donations. So I would take those off, and I'd let the parties invest in their candidates, invest in mobilizing as much as possible. Don't put restriction on how much they can give their candidates. Let them make those decisions. that would go a long way. A few
Yeah.
other things, because what this would do, it would downplay the direct impact of individual ideological donors on vetting candidates, choosing who to give money to. It would reduce the impact of these wealthy outside groups spending money in elections to support their favorite candidate. So I want to diminish the impact of these groups that currently dominate the system. Now, one controversial thing that your viewers might wince at is, in the 1980s, the big bête noire was PACs, business PACs.
Yeah.
And so reformers wanted to squeeze them out with the McCain-Feingold reform, so they didn't allow them to give any more. They didn't adjust for inflation for business PACs giving money. And I think that was a mistake because even by the point that McCain-Feingold was passed, it was very little that business PACs can give to candidates. And business PACs tend to give not for ideological reasons, they just want to make friends. And so some of you, it might sound pernicious.
Yeah.
But in fact, Congress works better when people are not fighting to get the money of ideologues. And so I would say that they should raise the amounts that PACs, traditional PACs, can give to candidates, because they have a more moderating effect than what's coming from individual wealthy donors.
Yeah, and there's something too I'd want to highlight for the folks watching and the folks listening, which is, again, you may have heard the whole concept of letting businesses contribute more and shook your head at that, but there's a couple of things I'd keep in mind. Rightly or wrongly, the one thing the business community tends to like is stability. And generally they also have a brand name that can be affected if somebody veers too far, policy veers too far. The second thing I'd bring up as well is and I think getting back to something you said, is they're transparent. So there's at least some level of transparency as far as who's contributing. Whereas right now we have this situation where there are a lot of theoretical, very wealthy, who knows, but anonymous donors funding, like you said, Club for Growth, funding Citizens United, funding all these other super PACs that just have no accountability at all.
Yeah. My point, actually, to add to that, I think one of my concerns is business PACs are staying in their traditional lanes, business groups. But my fear is that when they see that these other organizations are giving to these so-called dark money groups, that they might start going in that direction, and then we won't know about corporations giving money. We want to channel them into routes of transparency and accountability, because businesses are basically risk averse. But if you take away that transparency and you institutionalize it, then they might be spending a lot of money in ways that aren't necessarily healthy for the political system.
Yeah. No, the one thing I see in all this is, if I'm kind of gaming this out going forward, it seems like you could almost create this tug of war where you have these very wealthy ideologues funding their own candidates, their own more polarizing candidates, in competition with the more moderate candidates being pushed by the party apparatus. Could you see that happening, or do you feel that's maybe
it is happening?
Yeah. Oh, okay. Well, yes.
And it actually is happening. I mean, Mitch McConnell has said, I'm getting involved in primary elections because he's afraid of, certain supporters picking candidates who are not going to do well.
Yeah.
The incentive for party leaders is let's control government. And that has an inherently moderating push to it.
Yeah.
So that battle, I expect to see more of that. It hasn't happened as much in the Democratic Party, but believe me, Nancy Pelosi tries to edge out candidates, push away candidates, or her secondary leadership, discourage people from entering races that might hurt the party control Congress.
Yeah.
And obviously activists don't like that, who support these candidates. But that is part of what the party does in building coalitions and trying to win control of government.
Yeah.
And I would argue that, giving them the resources to really, make some of those claims would be good for our political system.
Okay. What I'm loving about this conversation is you've taken two groups that people love to hate, which is the party apparatus and the business community, and actually elevated them above the real source of the problem, which again are these single issue groups and these ultra wealthy donors. To kind of flip that on its head, there was another question I wanted to ask you, which is if you look at like the Senate runoff in Georgia, you had a situation where there was a lot of money coming from out of state, and a lot of that money were just small dollar contributions, just people from all over the country who wanted their team to take control of the Senate. And so they were donating $10, $20 or whatnot. Do you think there's a potential, again, where you have competition between the party apparatus, you have competition between the ultra wealthy? Do you see your average, everyday, hyper partisan American voter being, their ability to aggregate funds together via the internet? Do you see that becoming a force, or not so much?
Well, small donors there are more small donors in the system. They don't actually carve out as much of a role because of super PACs now playing such a big role.
Yeah.
But they are important, especially in races, as you mentioned, special elections. They're very important in these high profile races, which attract national attention, and they send money there. And I do actually envision some tension between small donors and what, the interests of the party.
Yeah.
Because once again, small donors they are different from your average voter. They are more like, dare I say, they're more like people like you and me who really follow certain issues, are active in politics. They tend to be as extreme, if not more so, than large donors.
Yeah.
So you're not actually creating more either moderation or more robust distribution of preferences of people. So to say that small donors are your average American, they are not. They tend to be much more wealthy, educated, and they care about certain issues. And I think it's not accurate to say they're really the average American, when in fact those people already have tremendous influence because they're the same people who volunteer. There's this participation gap between one set of Americans and the rest of us, and that's these Americans are doing everything, and the parties are paying attention to them because they're doing everything.
Yeah.
So that's a big concern.
Yeah, as you were talking, like the only thing I could think about was the run up of GameStop stock, where you had this mob of people with extra money who just drove up the price, and we almost like are in a lot of ways maybe have GameStop politics, where if there's some really hot race or some real attractive personality, everyone just kind of goes to that side of the room.
Good analogy.
Yeah. Now, I know you mentioned campaign finance was part of it, but not all of it. Outside of reforming the finance system, giving the parties more power, what are some other reforms that you feel are high up on the list?
So one reform, again, I'm concerned about, the gatekeeping power parties. I think primaries have to be reconsidered. We're not going to get rid of primaries. I mean, some of, the way I'm talking sounds like I'm the professor of bad government.
Yeah.
But because I'm challenging some very progressive, good government nostrums. But
I'm loving it. I'm hearing all of it. So yeah.
But I do think the parties, they can't be just free for alls. I think the parties have a role to play again, the way they used to. Not the way they used to.
Yeah.
They're not going to be smoke-filled rooms. They won't even be vape-filled rooms. They're going to be places where that the voters ultimately decide. But you need some bit of vetting. So, for instance, the party leaders, local, state, should be able to say, this candidate came out of nowhere, never been participate in party affairs, hasn't run for office before, no experience. We don't think they should be on the ballot. And there could be certain rules about how they get about. Now that could obviously lead to some, you might not get people like Barack Obama running for office in Chicago if the parties were given that much power.
Yeah.
Although he was active in politics to some extent. So he wouldn't be somebody I would disqualify. Yeah. He was of the community and he was very much involved. But I would give him some of that role. But I'd also add to that, when the voters vote, this might be something that you, in our previous discussions, I understand you admire. This is ranked choice voting,
Yeah.
the primary. And your listeners probably know about this. And that's to allow voters to rank their preferences. And what happens today is if there's a big field, 10, 15 candidates, somebody, 20% of the vote could win, who's not even well liked by other members of the party. And that wouldn't necessarily happen with ranked choice voting. You'd get the second choice, perhaps, that's more fulfilling to the rest of the party. And that's the role that party leaders used to play. It's like, well, this person looks like a star, but doesn't satisfy this faction or that faction. Here's somebody who might seem more like milk toast to you, but actually everybody kind of thinks they're good.
Yeah. I think, something I've never verbalized on this show, but was kind of brought to mind as you were talking is if you look at the role of an election, it's really to send a signal to government about popular opinion. And the system for sending that signal, as you mentioned earlier on, was the political party, where the party's interest in ultimately maintaining the goodwill of their constituents and getting more candidates elected. And the signal, as you said, seems to be broken now by the fact you can have these candidates that win with a minority of the vote. And the one who comes to mind right out of the gate is Marjorie Taylor Greene, who 8-person primary, not a hyper partisan district. It was red, but it's also, it's Fulton County. It's not crazy to the right. And again, 8 candidates, she won with 40% of the vote, and any of those other moderates were indiscernible from her. So your choice was, your run-of-the-mill Republican or QAnon. And I think certainly, I've always been a big advocate on this podcast of ranked choice voting. And I think, certainly that'd be a way to allow the kooks, let's just call them what they are, but, allow the kooks to get in and have their say and not have a party apparatus that appears to be quashing these folks. Cause I think that could create some blowback as well.
Right.
Yeah.
I agree.
Yeah. One last question for you. If I'm just your regular run-of-the-mill voter, which I am, and I want to take action, I'm concerned about campaign finance and I want to do something to affect it or to have a positive impact where I live. Are there ways I can take action?
Yeah, I think there are a few things you can do. It's a complicated business because obviously you're piercing at the interests of politicians, but you're also dealing with unintended consequences because I think all reforms have some consequences we don't expect.
Yeah.
But I didn't mention this, but I do think public financing can play an important role here. Not necessarily the type of public financing that's being pushed in, for instance, HR 1, this bill that's coming out of Congress right now.
Yeah.
Because what HR 1 does is they're going to match contributions of a small donor.
Mm-hmm.
There's something to be said for that. Yeah, you want people who are less wealthy, and they are less wealthy too. But again, they're the same types of people. They're not, your average voter really participating. So I would prefer, instead of focusing on the individual donor, I would prefer if you gave grants to the party, public subsidy grants to not just the Democrat Republican Party, give it to the Green Party, whoever has registered voters, and they could decide what to do with it. Or you can give grants to the candidates.
Yeah.
So because right now the current system is going to reinforce polarization, and if you give public grants, you should have, just like Madison argued about pluralism in the way we structure our government, we should have pluralism in how we get money. Mm-hmm. Have some from individual donors, some organizational donors like PACs, parties, and some public subsidies. Mix it in so no one's kind of obligated to one set of constituencies. And that's kind of how I think about campaign finance. And don't put spending caps on these things because think in terms of building canals, not dams. All right, canals, not dams, because you want to have the tributaries of money go to transparent, accountable groups. And I think there happen to be parties. You might prefer candidates. Have them to go to those groups, and have politicians be able to have enough money to have a voice. okay, to be able to get their message out. By the way, I didn't mention parties fund challengers more than any other institutions. Okay, so that's another reason why you would want parties to control a lot of money, because again, they want to win things. So when you think about reform, try to think it out of the conventional sense of let's just stop the flow of money, let's just make sure it's really low contributions, because that's just a recipe for outside dark money spending.
Yeah.
The hydraulics of politics of money is going to go somewhere else. So try to move away from that conceptual understanding of it.
I love it. I love it. Well, Ray, I could keep you well into the afternoon, but I know you have things to do. So I really appreciate the time. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Dan. I enjoyed being here.